You were here in Boston.
Is he the only one, probably, you think of?
Most likely, maybe Tilly Teixeira, who's probably our senior member who got married in this church in the 50s. So she has a little bit of historical perspective.
I was rereading, you sent me the tape of it, my talk, which I was glad to get. And then I published a slightly expanded version with references to the Pentagon Papers, which I didn't make in my talk because they hadn't come out yet. In the last chapter of my book, Papers on the War. And I'm really struck. Has anybody on the screen here actually looked at that last chapter or read it? Joe has, and Ray.
Well, it's 11 a.m. and I would like to get us going on time. And there are 8 people waiting to come in. Evelyn, Susan Mirsky, Mark with a C. I don't know a lot of these people. Here's somebody from Frederick, Maryland. Here's somebody who's just a number. We have Phoebe Knopf. We have Helen Jacquard. We have Victor M. We have Renee Kaczynski. And we have Dorothy Weitzman. All in. So I am going to declare us officially started and just welcome you to Community Church of Boston. Charlie, if you could keep on top of all these people that are coming in that we have to admit one by one, make sure there's no riffraff. Put them in timeout until we straighten them out. We welcome all of you to Community Church. We're lonely in the auditorium, but we are joined by several people like our board member Ed Pasanese and Carolyn Poinelli, who is our also frequent member attendee at the church. And we are also joined by Boston Jazz's finest 2 players, in my estimation, who have been with us before, and I just can't say enough about how thrilled I am to have them. They're right behind me, and I'm going to introduce them and give Tim the microphone to introduce this first selection. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Tim Ray and Dan Greenspan to our humble Community Church of Boston stage.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean. We're really glad to be here, be back, and performing some music and being part of this great meeting. So we're going to start off with a jazz tune, a standard tune composed by Herbie Hancock. This was on a recording he put out of all music relating to water and the ocean. This particular song is called Dolphin Dance.
I lost the sound. Dean, we have no sound.
Accidentally muted them. The admitting participants just popped up and all of a sudden mute. Thank you, Tim and Dan. Tim Ray, Dan Greenspan. Profound beauty, grace, style, and elegance. Well, welcome everybody. We always start with a candle that I can't find. I just did it. Where did it go? Maybe we won't have a candle.
I did see it somewhere.
If I stood out in the rain night, my only light a candle, a million miles away, would you lay down your fire as I raised mine? Would you not kill again? And oh, when you're near me, oh my love, oh my joy, there's nothing ever to weary me, oh my darling one. That song is called Rain Night by Cindy Callett. We light this candle today to wish you a happy and strange holiday and in anticipation of a really wonderful gathering here to honor not only an amazing man and a social activist, we welcome, after an absence of almost a half a century, Dan Ellsberg to be with us today and make some remarks and receive our accolades. We also welcome some wonderful folks who are going to give him the introduction that he deserves. I'm going to put the candle down and just tell you a little about what's going on at Community Church. We got a new newsletter out. Here's a newsletter. If you have not received this and would you like a piece of paper in the mail, give us your address in the chat section and we will send it to you, or else let us know by email that you'd like to join our mailing list, comchurch, C-O-M-M, church, C-U-R-C-H, at gmail.com. And we will add you to our mailing list to find out about what's going on in the next 2 months at Community Church. We start out with a bang with, of course, Dan Ellsberg, and next Sunday with Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges, please don't pay any mind to the typo of my own making that says that it's Chris Hayes. It's not Chris Hayes, it's Chris Hedges. We are just so honored that he will be joining us next Sunday. After that, there is a December 22nd, which is a Tuesday night music gathering that will feature yours truly and our friends Bennett and Lorraine Hammond and a few other invited guests, sort of an open mic on a solstice holiday theme. I hope you will join us for that as well. And then we go all the way into January, and I won't list everything that's going on, but plenty going on. We had, just 2 weeks ago, Norm Stockwell, editor of The Progressive, and we just got in the mail from Norm a free subscription to The Progressive, Madison, Wisconsin. This will be in the church for when you come back to join us. Just tons of great articles, and Norm is, I knew him about 25 years ago when I was traveling out there for music. He was in radio at that time, and he is now the editor of The Progressive, and he immediately had some great ideas for speakers for us, different authors who have written for The Progressive. Anyway, he sent me this calendar as well that lists for December 13th. Let me see what it lists. Samuel Gompers, founder of the American Federation of Labor, dies. The day before, the Supreme Court decides Bush v. Gore in 2000. 1924 was when Gompers passed away. And in this same weekend, also in 2008, Bernie Madoff arrested and charged with securities fraud. So that's the beginning of our sort of weekly thought. And then we go to another one that I've just loved showing, and that is Eduardo Galeano, Children of the Days. Eduardo Galeano from Uruguay, maybe my favorite author of all time. And let's see what he said. This is Eduardo Galeano writes in small vignettes, which are perfect for daily thoughts. Here's December 13th. International Day of Choral Singing with your mask on. To enable, in 1589, Pope Sixtus V decided that castrated men should sing in St. Peter's Basilica. To enable male singers to become sopranos of high notes and unbroken trills, their testicles were mutilated. For more than 3 centuries, castrated men took the place of women in church choirs. The sinning voices of the daughters of Eve, which would have soiled the purity of the sanctuaries, were forbidden. Sorry if you think that that's too irreverent for church, but that is Eduardo Galeano for December 13th. I invite you to go on our website and our Facebook page. In addition to the events that we're doing on Sundays, we also co-host events with Encuentro Cinco, who is now our roommate in the building, and also the organization Shelter and Solidarity, which is out of UMass Boston, Joe Ramsey and Suren Mudliar. Look for their events on our Facebook page or our website. Also, in the month of January, we're going to start doing as many Wednesday events as we can come up with. We have a couple already planned. One is Wednesday, the second Wednesday in January, and it's a program on disabilities and people with disabilities and following the laws on disabilities. And then the fourth Wednesday in January, we have Cray Novick, who is a young filmmaker who just spent a bunch of time in Cuba, and he will be showing us his documentary, and there'll be a Q&A and commentary afterwards, Cray Novick, and a bunch of other great programs. So join us for that. And let's go back to our friends Tim Ray and Dan Greenspan for a couple of numbers. This is what we call the musical message. And here's the introduction. I hope the sound doesn't go off again. Sorry about that.
Yes, we'll hope the sound stays on. Thank you, Dean. We're going to continue with another song composed by a great jazz musician who's still with us, Wayne Shorter. And this one is called Edda, E-D-D-A.
Tim Ray, Dan Greenspan. Oh yeah, just such an inspiration. It's time for me to introduce the introducer. We are so glad that Joe Gerson is here to talk to us a little bit about Dan Ellsberg. Joe sent me a couple of things that I can't retrieve now because it's about the laptop and finding an email and whatnot. But I just, what we all know, that Joe, for his entire life and a half a century and more, has worked on issues of disarmament, the end to military madness, and for many years as part of the American Friends Service Committee, and now heading up all kinds of initiatives. I am just really honored to welcome Joe Gerson to introduce Dan Ellsberg.
Dean, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to introduce Dan, a man named Most Dangerous Man in America by Robert McNamara. McNamara, you'll remember, presided over the genocidal Vietnam War. Before going deeper, just to say that my favorite book by Galliano is The Book of Embraces, and I'd recommend it to everyone. Simply to say that Dan has not only been long on the right side of history, he has made many and enormous contributions to pushing the proverbial arc of history toward human survival and justice. Like Sacco and Vanzetti, our heroes are human. They feel, they worry, they struggle. The companion of their courage is sacrifice. It was at a weekend retreat in Wellfleet that I first heard Dan share the traumas that forged his character when he responded to a speaker's question of when will the sleeping man wake. Dan began with background about his mother's ambition that he become a piano virtuoso. The talk, his response centered on how his mother and sister died in a car crash, and concluded with the commitment forged within him to ensure that innocence never be sacrificed. But resolve is not action. I want to stress Dan's personal and intellectual courage, the latter of which is little understood or respected in our society. As Dan described in his book Secrets, even before risking his life in prison by making public the Pentagon Papers, secret history of the decision-making for the Indochina War, Dan had explored the meanings and potential of nonviolent resistance and had risked his career by joining anti-war demonstrations in the streets of our nation's capital. Since then, Dan has been jailed many times for committing nonviolent civil disobedience to end wars, to end the nuclear arms race, and to oppose other injustices. Ironically, it was only a few years ago, long after his father's death, that Dan learned that he's a chip off his father's block. Before few besides Teller and Oppenheimer conceived the possibility of hydrogen bombs, his father turned down the request that he oversee the construction of the Hanford nuclear bomb factory. While we can all recognize physical courage, Dan's intellectual courage also needs to be recognized and celebrated. How many people do you know who are willing to describe themselves as a war criminal? And given the reality of that the United States has been at war almost continuously for the past 4 generations, there are many war criminals among us. Even before releasing the Pentagon Papers, there was Dan's book, Papers on the War, a valuable resource for those of us organizing against the war. And I remember well Dan's speech in 1991 about the dangers of the approaching First Gulf War on the Boston Common on a bitterly cold and icy January day. More recently, he has revealed a host of other secrets, nuclear secrets, once buried and lost, publishing them with analysis and prescriptions to prevent nuclear catastrophe in his most recent book, The Doomsday Machine, his Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Dan earned McNamara's moniker when in 1971, he became an international hero and outlaw for the ostensible crime of trying to end the Indochina War, to stop the killing, by revealing the history of the Vietnam War decision-making to the US and the world's people. That was That was the top secret 7,000-page report commissioned by McNamara titled U.S. Decision Making in Vietnam, 1945 to 68, the Pentagon Papers. Dan knew about the report and where to find it because he was one of its primary authors. For his conscientious and courageous action, Dan was indicted under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 109 years in prison. But his conviction was thrown out after it was revealed that Nixon's plumbers, the men who the following year broke into the Democratic Party's Watergate headquarters, had broken into a psychiatrist's office and stolen Dan's medical records. Dan was initially trained as an economist. After completing his BA, he joined the Marines, later returning to Rand and Harvard, where he completed his PhD on game theory. How many of us really understand game theory? The Britannica reports that, quote, in 1964, Ellsberg left Rand to join the Department of Defense, where he was tasked with analyzing the expanding U.S. military effort in Vietnam. The following year, he was transferred to the State Department, with his headquarters at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. There, he accompanied troops on patrols to evaluate the war effort. During that time, Dan concluded that the war could not be won. As Dan has described, it was near the end of one of those futile day-long patrols that he turned to an equally exhausted GI and remarked that they were fighting in the tradition of King George's redcoats during our country's Revolutionary War. On Dan's return to the U.S., he worked at Rand on what became the Pentagon Papers. And along the way, at age 30, Dan had drafted the U.S. nuclear warfighting doctrine and served as nuclear weapons advisor to Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Martin Luther King wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail that civil disobedience is undertaken only after every legal option to right or wrong has been tried and failed. At a time when the Vietnamese death toll was more than 300 children, women, and men a day, in his effort to stop the killing, Dan offered the Pentagon Papers to a number of members of Congress. They could have legally published the papers in the congressional record, but none were willing to take the political risk. Leaving Rand in 1970, Dan came to MIT, where in 1971, with the help of Gara Plevovitz, MIT graduate students who have yet to come forward for fear of prosecution, Howard Zinn and others, he made portions of the Pentagon Papers available to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other papers across the country. As the 2017 film The Post taught a new generation, in addition to the Pentagon Papers helping to build opposition to the war, the Nixon administration's efforts to block publication of our Vietnam history led to a seminal Supreme Court decision. The court affirmed the relative independence of the Fourth Estate, ruling that the federal government had not made the case for prior restraint of publication. It is a precedent that we need to continue to build on in the face of unrelenting right-wing efforts to undermine and eliminate constitutional democracy, in spite of the fact that our 230-year-old Constitution is increasingly clear about its anti-democratic and racist limitations. Dan's books include papers on the war, risk, ambiguity, and decision, secrets, and his recent The Doomsday Machine. He received the Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, as well as the Olof Palme Prize. If I remember correctly, I first met Dan Ellsberg in the run-up to the Pentagon Papers trial. I next met him 5 years later when I arranged for him to speak at Arizona State University, several years after his sentence had been avoided. Young, curious, and insensitive, I had questions for our esteemed visitor and listened to him very closely. As we walked across the ASU campus, I asked him a few questions. Having read about anti-Semitism in the Marines, I asked Dan what it was like to be a Jewish Marine in the 1950s. His answer came as a surprise. Dan was raised as a Christian Scientist. That was when I first heard Dan's cogent redcoats analogy, and I learned that what we call absent-mindedness can be a reflection of a brilliant mind hyper-focused on what is most important. Consumed by Newsweek's publications that day of the Woodward and Bernstein's All the President's Men, Dan left his sports coat jacket in Los Angeles and ended up wearing the only one I owned when he gave this talk. I had to remind him whose jacket he was wearing the next day when he was walking out our front door on his way to the airport. Knowing what he knew, Dan became a leading figure in the nuclear weapons freeze movement of the early 1980s. One detail that has largely been lost to history is the connecting thread between Dan's decision to risk life in prison by releasing the Pentagon Papers and the freeze movement. The name of that thread is Randy Keeler. As Dan poignantly described, it was in hearing Randy explain why he was willing to go to prison for 5 years rather than being drafted and fight in the criminal Vietnam War, that Dan painfully concluded that if Randy, knowing what he knew as a recent college graduate, was willing to risk those 5 years, knowing what Dan knew, he should risk everything to stop the murder of the war. It was Randy who a decade later had the inspiration of taking the concept of a nuclear weapons freeze to voters in Western Massachusetts referenda, thus igniting the grassroots political storm that prevented the deployment of Euro missiles and led to the INF Treaty and the end of the Cold War, even before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The high point of the freeze movement was the largest peace demonstration in US history. It was an actual million-person march and rally. Many here on this session this morning were probably there. Some of you may remember that there were a series of in-person meetings to plan the event. And in those meetings, a vote was taken to maximize the number of people who would turn out and not to alienate some liberals. The vote was taken in which it was decided that US foreign military inventions would not be mentioned in the march's call or rally. Remembering that Henry Kissinger had placed nuclear forces on alert at the end of the 1973 October War, I wasn't happy about that decision. My concern deepened when on June 5th, Israel invaded Lebanon, and we faced the possibility of Syria intervening to counter Israel. The Soviet nuclear arsenal stood behind Syrian forces, and the US arsenal was fully behind Israel and its aggression. In spite of this potential danger, only one speaker had the courage to break ranks and name the potential danger. In the weeks that followed, my disappointment at our movement's failing amidst its great success led me to want to better understand the history of how US nuclear arsenal and weapons had been used to reinforce the empire. That led me to Dan's introduction to Protest and Survive, a book edited by E.P. Thompson and Dan Smith of the European Nuclear Disarmament Movement. The title of Dan's introduction was Call to Mutiny. That essay and a conversation I later had with Dan transformed my understanding of how nuclear weapons are used and led to Dan speaking at what became the first of 30 Deadly Connection conferences across the country. It also laid the foundation for much of my scholarly work and movement framing, so I'm just deeply indebted to Dan. As Dan wrote, and I'll quote here at some length, the notion common to nearly all Americans that no nuclear weapons have been used since Nagasaki is mistaken. It is not the case that US nuclear weapons have simply piled up over the years, unused and unusable, save for a single function of deterring their use against by the Soviets, read now the Russians. Again and again, generally in secret from the American public, US nuclear weapons have been used for quite different purposes in the precise way that a gun is used when you point it at someone's head in a direct confrontation. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. Dan cited an interview with William Dias, the US Assistant Secretary of State, in which he asked if the US, in which Dias was asked if the US would ever initiate nuclear war. Here's that chilling quotation from Dias. The Soviets know that this terrible weapon has been dropped on human beings twice in history, and it was an American president who dropped it both times. Therefore, they have to take this into consideration in their calculus. To further demonstrate the truth of his metaphor about the armed robber pointing the gun at his victim's head, Dan went on to list a number of times since Nagasaki that the US prepared and or threatened to initiate nuclear war during international crises and wars. Truman during the 1946 Iran crisis, the 1948 Berlin blockade, and Truman again in the early stage of the Korean War. Eisenhower in 1953 in Korea, and 54 in Vietnam, 58 in China. Kennedy during the Berlin crisis, and most dangerously during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then there was Nixon's 1969 Manhattan nuclear madman nuclear mobilization, and the Carter Doctrine, which threatened to use all means necessary to preserve what were euphemistically termed U.S. interests in the Middle East. Dan continued that, quote, the current dilemma in the Middle East merely highlights the historical legacy of an earlier generation in which strategic nuclear monopoly permitted and encouraged the United States' claim to rights to intervention in what amounted to, quote, spheres of predominant influence. Those claims ran right up to the borders of the Soviet and Chinese occupation everywhere in the world. He continued that within that sphere of influence, the incentive to threaten or launch nuclear weapons to protect U.S. interventionary troops is not limited to prospective confrontations with Russian forces. Those threats continue today. Obama threatened to use all means necessary to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. Trump brought us closer to nuclear war with his fire and fury threats than most people realize. And with misnamed missile defense deployments and the $2 trillion program to upgrade the U.S. nuclear arsenal and its delivery systems, the U.S. is again on the path to exercising nuclear supremacy. Dan concluded that introductory essay with a call that in many ways has defined his life and others since then. Quote, like Americans resisting the symbolic draft registrations or sitting on railroad tracks at Rocky Flats, and he went on to compare the nuclear Armageddon to the mass suicide at Jonestown, some of you will remember. He cried out, no, not our children. This is craziness. We won't be part of it. It is none too soon to be saying this to the president, prime minister, chairman, Jim Jones of the world, nor is it yet too late. It is mutiny time in Jonestown, the revolt of the hostages. Let me conclude this introduction by referencing Dan's prologue to the Doomsday Machine. In 1961, on behalf of President Kennedy, Dan posed a question to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. If the general plan for nuclear war were implemented, how many people would be killed in the Soviet Union and China? When the answer came back, the lowest number was 275 million people. And by the end of 6 months, 325 million people. Dan concludes the prologue with these words. From that day on, I've had one overriding life purpose, to prevent the execution of any such plan. Dan, thank you for all that you have done.
Thank you, Joe. Joe Gerson, with his work on the deadly connection, was one of the very few people who had read my descriptions of our nuclear policy in terms of our use of actual nuclear weapons by using them as a gun is pointed at someone in a crisis, with his own list of cases and his showing that our first strike capabilities, our strategic capabilities, were closely linked to backing up the credibility of our threats of first use. When Joe mentions the deadly connection on which he's lectured and written many times, that's the connection he's making, that actually the threat of our first strike, of attacking the homeland of our superpower adversary or supposed adversary, that's to deter second use by the Soviets or Russians to our first use, which we continue to make. As Donald Trump says, I would be the last to use them, he said in his campaign, except that he would not take them off the table under any circumstances, and has not till this time. But that's not just the policy of Donald Trump. It was the same policy of Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, every president we've had since 1945. After all, in our first 4 years of the nuclear era, from 1945 to 1949, we had a monopoly of nuclear weapons. We built them up by 52 to 1,000 fission bombs of the type that destroyed Nagasaki under Truman. And the Russians had exploded one in 1949, had a couple of them in 51, but essentially there was no first strike capability because there was no second strike capability. We had the only, or to put it another way, are the only nuclear policy of the nuclear state in the world, the US, was to initiate nuclear war under various circumstances. But by the early 50s, the Soviets had in fact acquired the ability to destroy Europe almost entirely. By the early 60s, they had many hundreds of medium-range and intermediate-range missiles of the kind that Khrushchev later installed in 62 into Cuba. Could reach the United States, but they could reach Europe as early as the early 50s, which meant that if we carried out our NATO policy of countering a Soviet move against Berlin or against West Europe, against West Germany and West Europe, in what our intelligence always described as an extremely unlikely event. But I go back to the much less unlikely event that they attempted to interfere with our access to Berlin, we would initiate nuclear war. Under Eisenhower, we had no other plan, essentially, because he feared the budget consequences of trying to match the Soviets in their non-nuclear, their conventional forces. And so the idea of massive, quote, retaliation to a non-nuclear attack, whether it was in Komoy, in a couple of crises in the 50s, or Korea, or Yugoslavia, or Berlin, we would attack under Eisenhower not only every city in Russia, but every city in China. The idea of the Sino-Soviet bloc, in part, the notion that it would be crazy for the two superpowers to destroy each other and leave China the master of the world, assured that all of our plans involved destroying China along with Russia, no matter how the war started. Now, this is an insane plan, very obviously. Let me put it another way. I have to correct that. It was the plan and threat of a clearly insane action. As Joe has already described at the beginning of my book, I described the fact that John Kennedy was informed, thanks to the question that I drafted for him to address to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that actually carrying out the plans for initiating nuclear war in the event of an assault on Berlin would involve 600 million deaths by our attack. That included 100 million deaths by fallout of our Western allies, the NATO allies, from the fallout of our own attacks on East Europe, the satellite nations where another 100 million would die from our attacks, and on Russia. The fallout from these attacks would be pretty much confined to the northern hemisphere because the winds from the equator blow away from the equator. So the fallout, the radioactive fallout in the atmosphere is pretty much confined to the hemisphere where the attacks occur. But our own attacks then would have destroyed, they said, 600 million, and that was not accounting for fire, which they said was too hard to calculate. They knew that that was the major effect of thermonuclear weapons, H-bombs, but depends on winds, depends on climate, weather, and the fuel loading of the cities we were hitting. So they didn't calculate that, but that would have brought the total factor up. It was described later by the National Academy of Sciences to something like 1 billion or 1.5 billion in connection with the attacks by the Russians, mainly on Europe at that time in 1961 under Kennedy, when we did that. Now, 1.5 billion was half the population of the world, 3 billion at that time. 1 billion, a third, 600 million, a fifth. As Edward Teller, the inventor of the H-bomb, the discoverer, used to say, oh, you could only kill a quarter of the Earth's population with his, he was called the father of the H-bomb, with his offspring. The H-bomb's only a quarter, the glass 3/4 full, in effect. Well, he was wrong at the time about that. It would have been closer to a third, a half, so forth, but nobody's perfect on that. It was actually a situation much worse than that, and I'll come back to that. But by the mid-60s, in response to our supposed victory in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets had been induced, in the absence of any attempt on our part to restrain them by any arms control agreement that would restrain us as well. And later, a number of such agreements did come into being. They didn't lead, in most cases, to the destruction of any weapons, but they kept a ceiling on the number of weapons that each side would have, a somewhat decreasing ceiling over time. Those agreements have been swept off the board by Donald Trump, and the one on the strategic weapons, which would limit us to 1,550 weapons, a new start, is due to expire on February 5th. So either Biden, almost in his first act, manages to rescue that treaty, there will be no restraint on either side of these weapons. Now, the point I want to make here is, on the first instance, what was being threatened was an act of the utmost insanity. And there are other words that can be used for it, which I'll come to. That didn't mean necessarily that the threat to use them, the risk of doing it, was insane. There was, after all, no other way to protect Berlin, because I guess I hadn't just came across this quote in my book, which I'm led to read, by the way, because this is came out in 1972 when I was on trial. The last chapter of it is the lecture that I gave almost 50 years ago, May 23rd, 1971. So I was invited to do this, and the idea of a 50th anniversary of my first giving this lecture. And the title of the lecture is The Responsibility of Officials in a Criminal War. And I mentioned in that I had been impressed by the possibility that Khrushchev, although he was not Hitler, might be led to act like Hitler in some circumstances, as if he were Hitler. It didn't occur to me, by the way, that the US would ever consider or perpetrate such threats, although I myself was involved in them eventually. But I quoted in the course of some lectures that I gave in Boston Library, Lowell lectures for the Lowell Institute, on the theory, or the art of coercion. And the first lecture was on the theory and practice of blackmail. And after I had given one of these lectures, in a second lecture, I was able to quote, or I had to quote, Khrushchev saying in June 23rd, 1959, talking now, he had already told Eisenhower that he was going to sign a peace agreement with East Germany, which this was well after the war, more than a decade. And he was going to sign the peace agreement, which meant that East Germany would control the access routes to Berlin rather than the Soviets, and presumably would block our assets unless we recognized East Germany, which, as a legitimate state that could inspect our convoys, which our ally Konrad Adenauer of the Christian Democrats was determined not happened. He wanted to say he was the only legitimate elected leader in Germany and the true leader of all of Germany, and that Berlin would be the capital of it if that was ever recognized. And we backed that up for alliance reasons, basically. That meant then, in the plans all this time, if the East Germans did block the convoy, backed up by 22 Soviet armed divisions, they're crack divisions in that area, we could send patrols in to see if they would get through, and our access, which had been guaranteed as of 1945, 15 years earlier, if they were stopped, we would send a larger patrol. And if that was stopped, as Mort Halpern once put it, we send perhaps a demonstration nuclear weapon, tactical weapon, to show we were prepared to go to nuclear war. And as Mort put it, and if that doesn't work, we blow up the world. It sounds as though we were threatening something crazy, and that's precisely what we were doing. But here's what Khrushchev was confronting us with. June 23rd, your generals talk of maintaining your position in Berlin with force. That is bluff. If you send in tanks, they will burn, and make no mistake about it. If you want war, you can have it. But remember, it will be your war. Our rockets will fly automatically. Well, ominous talk. Khrushchev was telling his East German allies, Kennedy doesn't want to blow up the world, doesn't want a nuclear war, just to maintain his position in Berlin and refuse to recognize East Germany. So he's bluffing. We can do this. But he wasn't sure. And he was right not to be sure. Under Eisenhower and again under Kennedy, all of our planning involved using nuclear weapons, the ability to use nuclear weapons if we were blocked in Berlin. At that time, in 59, 60, 61, as of 61, in fact, 61, yes. We learned in September of 1961 that the Russians had 4 strategic missiles, 4 ICBMs, not the 1,000 that General Power, its Strategic Air Command, was estimating at that time, 1,000. Lesser estimates by the CIA and others were in the area of about 160, 120. We had 40. Actually, those were wrong. Power was wrong by 250 times. So he had 4. The chance then that he would have a first strike was nil. There was no chance. We could launch a first strike with the probability that we would destroy his 4 missiles at Plesetsk and even find some submarines. If he had 1 or 2 submarines in the area, possibly, there might not be a single warhead land on the US. But Europe would be annihilated, entirely annihilated. Khrushchev, as I say, started out in the 50s thinking, I have them hostage. That's the word he used, sufficiently hostage. He can't do anything here. Our rockets will fly automatically. He can't move to nuclear weapons. It turned out, though, the Russians and the US did not back down in the face of that and insisted and continued to plan that we would carry out these forces. Actually, in October of 61, as someone who thought of myself as never having made nuclear threats and not being in favor of nuclear threats, I actually drafted a speech for Deputy Secretary Roswell Gilpatrick, that informed the Russians that we had found out their bluff, that they had tens, hundreds, thousands of nuclear weapons. I said, and this was quoted by Gilpatrick, our ability to strike second is greater than the Russian ability to strike first. And we had, in other words, that their threats would not keep us from carrying out our commitments to nuclear war. In August of 61, Kennedy had actually talked about, had said, we will maintain our commitments, and this is before, by the way, the new estimate had become clear, and called on the US public to build fallout shelters. Very few of them realizing, presumably, that he was talking about fallout from a Russian retaliation to our attack on them, initiative on them. But to make it clear that he said, we do not unnecessarily risk all-out war, but we will not shrink from that risk. He said Berlin is said to be untenable, but Bastogne was untenable, and so for that matter was Stalingrad. It's almost an exact quote. Any place can be tenable if brave men are willing to fight for it. But the fighting in this case involved carrying out our nuclear war plans, which involved, as I say, in his own mind, or at least he'd been told, hundreds of millions of deaths. Now, I believe in retrospect that Kennedy was bluffing, essentially, at that. That's a very late conclusion based on a lot of things, which I won't go into now. But even Atchison was saying, now, if it came to that in the end, we would back down, we should back down. Although backing down would mean not getting reelected against Goldwater or anybody else in 1964, and possibly being impeached, as he actually said, next year in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So no president has actually backed down, but no president has actually faced this degree of risk. Now, the point I want to make is, though, that the threat we were making then, now, not as in 1950 when we had a monopoly of nuclear weapons, that the threat involved the annihilation of Europe at the least. And similar threats a little bit later involved the annihilation with the Russians of the Northern Hemisphere. As a matter of fact, as I'm going to say in a moment, it was already worse than that, although they didn't know that. When I saw the estimate that Joe Gerson described in his introduction here, quoted from me, about the 600 million, I had two types of thoughts. One was, this is the most evil plan that has ever existed in the history of humanity as a plan, as a possibility. I knew it was not a bluff. Khrushchev had bluffed in the late 50s, making threats he had no physical capability of carrying out. We had this physical capability deployed all around the world in far-flung bases, in carriers, in overseas bases, and at home in a growing number of missiles where missile launch, and they still are, were able within seconds of receiving an order to turn keys to get missiles out of the launch pads within 10 minutes of warning of an incoming attack. Because the missiles were vulnerable in those, as accuracy improved on both sides, the missiles of both sides became very vulnerable to attacks from the other side by missiles, submarine or land-based, which meant use them or lose them. If your extremely elaborate and expensive warning system on either side told you that you were about to be attacked, our plans were then and now on both sides for launch on warning to get those missiles out of the ground before they were destroyed, and to get them across 6,000 miles across the globe to destroy whatever other missiles and command and control and specifically, and air defenses and everything else that had not yet left their silos on the other side. Now, there is a problem with this from the beginning, at least I should say from the early 60s on. And the problem was that, a couple of problems. Well, I'll come back to this, but there was no advantage whatever to launching any of those missiles at first. I think I do have to go at this point into what we came to know only 20 years later, in 1983. And that was that an effect of the missiles, which had not ever been figured into our nuclear war planning, just as fire had never, and to this day, as far as I know, had never been calculated. The effects of fire, only blast and immediate radiation and fallout. Fire had not been figured in. Where there's fire, there's smoke. But in particular, the fire that is caused by a nuclear weapon, as at Hiroshima, creates a peculiar kind of fire called a firestorm, which is so widespread and so immediate that it creates winds that come in from each side. It affects the local weather, in effect, creating extremely high temperatures on the ground, killing everyone in the ground, as happened at Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo. Firestorms, the only three major firestorms in World War II. But Hiroshima gets you a firestorm every time, I mean a nuclear weapon, with the effect that the updraft that is caused by the incoming winds carries the smoke, and perhaps 150 million tons of it in an all-out attack, not into the upper atmosphere, but into the stratosphere, where it doesn't rain out. And there it's blown around the world, as we learned in, say, 1983, which is 37 years ago now, blown around the globe and shuts out about 70% of the sunlight, so that you have ice age conditions on the ground. Rivers and lakes freeze, but harvests are all destroyed for as much as a decade, year round, certainly for years. The worldwide supply of food is about 60 days, a lot of it concentrated in countries like ours that are major food exporters. The food export would stop immediately for all kinds of reasons. So other countries would starve very quickly. Ours would take perhaps much of a year to starve, but essentially then nearly everyone would be dead of starvation, nuclear winter, nuclear famine. This is not extinction, because there would be bands of people in Australia and New Zealand on the shores living on mollusks and fish, perhaps indefinitely. Maybe 10% of the people, maybe 1%, something like that. 90% would be killed. But that means whichever you go first, if you hit the cities, all of our plans now were focused on cities at that time, hundreds and hundreds of them, up to 1,000, with changes that Robert McNamara made and I made, drafting for him and so forth. In theory, you would have an option of not hitting cities. This had no effect on our plans or preparations, whatever we now know of the Air Force. They, instead of just labeling the city by name as a target, the targets became military targets in the cities or near the cities. Same DGs, ground zeros remained. The cities would burn to the same extent as before, wafting this smoke then into the stratosphere, whoever went first. And 100 to 200 weapons would suffice to create this whole-scale effect. India and Pakistan, with their over 100 weapons each, fission weapons, which can still burn the cities as well as thermonuclear, will not create a full nuclear winter. The effects they would have on sunlight of attacking each other's cities would starve to death perhaps 2 billion out of 7 billion people. Is there any possible excuse or justification for India and Pakistan having the ability and plans and rehearsals and threats for killing 2 billion people? That isn't a question hard to answer, I would say. How about the Russian and American capabilities and rehearsals and launch on warning plans that would kill close to, or perhaps more than 7 billion? We now have something like 7.5, 7.6 billion people in the world. So perhaps something close to 7 billion would be killed. This is not, of course, a plan that we will do. It's something simply that we rehearse doing under certain circumstances that have essentially happened a number of times. The false alarm on each side has happened several times to a point where there was a real belief for several minutes that we were under attack, and that the moment approached within minutes where the president, if he's still alive, should launch these weapons on warning. And each time the warning was seen to be false just before. At one point when Brezhnev had his hand on the red phone to inform the president that he would have to launch perhaps several hundred missiles in response to the 200 that were coming in. This was at 3 a.m. Brzezinski did not waken his wife lying next to him on the grounds that let her sleep. Why give her these last moments of terror? I can imagine a reason for doing that, but within remaining minutes. But anyway, he didn't waken her. He had his hand on the red phone to awaken the president after the first 2 calls had confirmed that hundreds of missiles were on their way in. When the third message came in, that it must be a false alarm, as it was, in fact. Why would he waken the president? Well, because all of our planning presumes that. there would in fact be absolutely no difference whether he launched our weapons or not at that point. The world was doomed in that effect. From the early 60s to this day, in other words, over half a century, 60 years or so, it has been entirely a delusion, a hoax, a chimera, on which our entire deployment, our strategic systems are based, that going first is less bad than going second. Very plausible. History of warfare, especially air war, has always been based on that assumption. But with fission weapons hitting near cities or thermonuclear weapons, no, it doesn't make any difference. And we've known that, as I say, since at least the early 80s. And that means, by the way, that not only the Northern Hemisphere is at stake under the various circumstances where we might launch, but the entire globe. As E.P. Thompson, that Joe mentioned, Marxist historian who tried to unite Europe and end the Cold War, I was helping him at various points, said at one point, it would not mean the extermination of humanity. It would mean the extermination of our civilization. That is true then when he wrote that. It's been true for the last 60 years and it hasn't changed. And as Thompson said, it would mean that for 2 millennia, every element of our culture and society, there would be a balance sheet drawn over the last 2 millennia. And for every element of our society and culture, a minus sign would be put in front of each total, meaning nothing would have prevented this and a lot of it would have contributed to it. Religion, culture, art, religion, politics, Congress, democracy, dictatorship, whatever, either had contributed to this result or failed to prevent it, meaning a total minus sign over the culture of the accomplishments of the last 2 millennia, you say. And as I say, it wouldn't lead to extinction, but it would put us back well before the last 2 millennia in population size, and we would have accomplished this. Now, since in the 50 years, since my talk at the community church, we have in fact made agreements that have reduced nuclear weapons on both sides of US and Russia. India and Pakistan have grown during that time, but US and Russia have reduced by more than 80%, more than 85%. Isn't this progress? Isn't this accomplishment? No, it is not. The risk of nuclear war, which was not zero, which was a positive possibility in 1961, has not reduced by an iota. And the scale of destruction has not reduced by an iota, nothing. No change has been made with that amount of reduction, given that both sides retain intercontinental ballistic missiles vulnerable to each other on 10-minute alert, given submarine launch missiles that on our side, not their side, that now are so accurate they can destroy the Russian ICBMs from submarines, meaning that they will remain on launch on warning possibility as long as we retain all these. That's what I mean when I say that each side has a doomsday machine, not doom in the sense that every living thing dies, although in the nuclear winter, nearly all other species would go totally extinct. They can't move from pole to pole and have fires and housing and whatnot, adapt in the way that we can. They go extinct. We don't go extinct, but 90% to 98%, let's say, do go. And I'm using that as a fair enough approximation of doomsday. The threat of doing this, and the actual, it continues explicitly, and the actual probability that it will occur is greater than zero, has not reduced. It has reduced at times from year to year when there was no Cold War for a few years in the 90s. When we didn't expect that our almost perhaps new ally, Russia, would launch against us unless they thought we were attacking them. And in fact, in one point of that, 1995, in the midst of this détente, Yeltsin was presented with a screen and a button to push to launch his missiles because a missile was heading toward Moscow, they thought. But they found he hesitated to do this, fortunately, long enough to realize that it was not going toward Moscow. It was, in fact, a Norwegian rocket to examine the aurora borealis effects from the Northern Sea, but was not headed toward Moscow, or we would not be here. What I'm saying is that the preparation for this is that, who's making that? Am I making that noise? Preparation for that has been not only the threat and the readiness of carrying out the ultimately insane action of destroying most human life, our civilization on Earth, life as we know it, as Eisenhower used to put it. We recognize it. On both sides, two doomsday machines. The very existence of this threat then creates the risk of these doomsday machines, which could be dismantled even without giving up all nuclear weapons. The world would be immeasurably safer without being totally safe if the hair trigger to the doomsday machines, the ICBMs, were removed. Actually, Obama, for example, for one, was in favor of doing that, proposed studies to do that. Former Defense Secretary William Perry, former head of the Strategic Command, who was in charge of these missiles, General Shortwright, have all even recently proposed doing that. There is no sign that either Trump or Biden will actually do that. And as I said, even without foregoing deterrence altogether, the doomsday machine could be dismantled on both the US and Russia, and for that matter, India and Pakistan could be brought down, in theory, very quickly, not to have the ability or the threat of describing. If the threat and the readiness to maintain these machines that could destroy most human life on Earth is a threat of a mad action, what do we say of the system as a whole? The unwillingness to counter the jobs, profits, donations, revolving door episodes of Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, Grumman, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics, the big five, to maintain this. If we're not willing to counter them, there's no indication that Biden is more willing to do this than Trump or than Obama was. As I said, Obama proposed it and backed off in the face of the political opposition that is involved in this military-industrial complex, let alone get rid of the large number of the hundreds and hundreds of sub-launched missiles, very accurate, that again could create nuclear winter. We come back. I thought that the 61 plan from Eisenhower we inherited was an evil plan. It was a readiness. How do we measure it as evil? It's not akin very well. What occurred to us as the extreme polar point of evil, and reasonably enough, was the deliberate destruction by Hitler of 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews. These are civilians killed in an industrial way, 60 million altogether in the war caused by Hitler, initiated by Hitler. But looking just at the figure we often use of 6 million, if that's evil, obviously that is evil. If that is not evil, what is? Okay. What do we say then of a readiness and threat and risk and preparedness and rehearsal of killing 600 million people or 6 billion? not deliberately as a definite plan like Hitler's, but as a contingency that by its very existence is a real possibility. As Lincoln said of slavery, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. Surely the existence of these things and machines is wrong. It has not changed in the last 60 years. Democrats and Republicans, of movements, of, as Joe described, millions of people marching against nuclear testing, the Freeze campaign to try to stop the development of new weapons for this, which are now underway on both sides. As a matter of fact, in other words, what's the problem here? Let me see how I'm coming on time. Yeah, we're getting near the end here. I should end it. I've described a very big part of the problem usually ignored. And that is, there were names of corporations: Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, etc., Raytheon. The new candidate, nominee for Secretary of Defense, a general, questions, of course, the civilian control support for what that's been worth over time. That's a question. But it's not an improvement to have a general in there who's on the board of Raytheon. Okay, one of the largest of the big five. He replaces Esper, who is also a long-term lobbyist for Raytheon, or maybe get this wrong. Stranahan before him was from Boeing, and so forth. So we're not getting a change there. Biden has actually spoken of increasing a defense budget, increasing it. It is now over $740 billion, but really closer to $1 trillion if all the costs are figured in. He needs to, Michel Flournoy, his earlier close to being nominee, talked about the need for new effects for space war and cyber war, and no talk of reducing it. Among the major candidates, only Bernie Sanders talked of reducing the budget by 10%, $70 billion, $74 billion for use for quite a few uses we have for that. I haven't talked here about climate. Barbara Lee proposed, and she'll be still here, cutting it in half, $350 billion. That's in the right ballpark for this, and certainly must include the most dangerous weapons of all, the ICBMs that provide the hair trigger to the doomsday machines. So it's not just a question of the number of warheads, but what the planning is in all this. When Kennedy was briefed on the war plan that I've just described, he was appalled, and he turned to Rusk as he left the room and said, "And we call ourselves the human race." Well, what else? What other species is not only capable of this, but even in the small, I mean, obviously not, but in the small, what other species commits war? Actually, several species of ants do perpetrate war against each other. No other animals. How about slavery, torture, massacre? These are all peculiarly human. They don't exhaust what it means to be human, but they're as human as anything else. And that is surely part of our problem. I had hoped at the time of putting out the Pentagon Papers that telling the public might make, I didn't have real confidence, but telling the president, I had learned from the papers themselves, had not made any difference over more than a quarter of a century. I tried telling Congress. They didn't put it out because they would be blamed for exposing secrets and would no longer have access to classified lies and secret testimony and whatever from, and have this peculiar responsibility for the Doomsday machine. So they didn't put it out either. So I thought perhaps the public will make the difference if the public only knew rather than the Tsar only knew it. Actually, that didn't make any difference either to the war. My talk here at the community church was on May 23rd, 1971. A year later started the heaviest bombing of the war. And in fact, it was during that getting toward the end here, but I want to quote this. A year after my talk at the community church, we have this conversation almost exactly here, April 21st, 11 months later. The president is saying, we've got to stop thinking of a 3-day trike. I'm thinking about things that go far beyond during the offensive of 72. I'm thinking of the dikes. I'm thinking of the railroad. I'm thinking, of course, the docks. Now, the dikes is an interesting thing. Who was it? Yodel, I believe, was hanged for destroying dikes in Holland in World War II. And when I was reading the Pentagon Papers, I read this by my former boss, Harvard law professor John McNaughton, who I knew was against our involvement in Vietnam. And his diary has recently come out in the last 10 years, showing that he constantly was saying out, he wanted out, he didn't want this and anything. But meanwhile, since LBJ did not want out, he was saying destruction to strikes at population targets of 66 are likely to create a counterproductive wave of revulsion abroad and at home, and increase the risk of enlarging the war with China and the Soviet Union, which would certainly involve with China nuclear weapons by us. Destruction of locks and dams, however, that's what Yodel was hanged for, I believe, if handled right, might, perhaps after the next pause, offer promise. It should be studied. Such destruction does not kill or drown people. By shallow flooding the rice, it leads after time to widespread starvation. More than 1 million? ? Unless food is provided, which we could offer to do at the conference table. Now, this was from a Harvard law professor who I knew opposed the war and wanted to get out. Well, that was 1966. 6 years later of war, after Nixon had now launched another 1.5 million tons of bombs since the Pentagon Papers until this time. In other words, as much as we launched in all of Europe in World War II, 1.5 million, all theaters, 2 million. And by the end in Vietnam, we had dropped more than 8 million tons, 4 times World War II. But 6 years later, Nixon then is saying, I'm thinking of the dikes, I'm thinking of the railroad. We've got to use massive force. Then the president asks 2 hours later, how many did we kill in Laos? Ziegler, the press officer, maybe 10,000, 15. Kissinger, in the Laotian thing, we killed about 10, 15. See, this was, by the way, the Laotian invasion that led me to put out the Pentagon Papers in 71. I could see where it was going. President, see the attack in the North we have in mind, power plants, POL, petroleum, the docks, and I still think we ought to take the dikes out now. Will that drown people? Kissinger, about 200,000 people. President, and I've heard this is a good imitation of this. No, I'd rather use the nuclear bomb. Have you got that, Henry? Kissinger, that I think would be just too much. The nuclear bomb, does that bother you? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake. And then On the day later, he's saying to him, Nixon is saying, the only place where you and I disagree, Henry, is with regard to the bombing. You're so goddamn concerned about the civilians, and I don't give a damn. I don't care. I'm concerned about the civilians because I don't want the world to be mobilized against you as a butcher. Okay. At one point before the Pentagon Papers came out, I was talking with Senator Goodell, who had proposed getting our troops out in 1 year, as we did, 6 of us at Rand. He later became a counsel in my case after the case started. And I'll never forget Goodell telling me, Dan, the American people don't care about Vietnamese deaths. They just don't care. Like Nixon here. And I said to him at that point, I hope you're not true. You're not correct. You might be right. I hope you're not, because then I don't see any way to end this war, because Nixon is going to decrease the number of our troops, rely on air power, decrease the number of US casualties and the dollar cost of the war. Though Vietnamese will be getting killed and made refugees at the same rate. And that is what happened the next 4 years. Do the American people care? I didn't know at that time for sure. In Iraq, how many Americans could give any figure to the number of Iraqi deaths we've caused? Bush mentioned at last 40,000 civilian deaths, a lot more. That's 10 times 9/11. That figure is probably wrong by more than maybe 20 times, 30 times. A better figure is 1 million, 1.5 million or more. 37 million refugees have been, quote, generated by the wars in the Middle East that we started, that George Bush and pursued under Obama and now Trump, and are still going. I'll close with this thought. I said in my speech in 71 that I was taking very seriously thoughts about World War II from the German perspective. Not, as Raoul Hilberg said, he wrote in his book, The Destruction of the European Jews. He said, this is not a book about the Jews. It's a book about the people who destroyed the Jews. And I had read that closely, and the reasons they gave for participating in that, almost none of the people involved in the Holocaust thought it was a good idea, but it was what the Fuhrer wanted. And they had promised they had actually taken an oath to the Fuhrer, a personal oath, to do what he wanted. And so this was it. As a matter of fact, Himmler had, well, I won't go into that, but very important quote. I know it pretty much by heart. Himmler had said to his SS generals in 1943 at Posen, very secret talk. He said, all of you here, the SS had been in charge of the camps, all of you have seen the bodies, seen 100 bodies, 500 bodies, 1,000 bodies. That we have seen these things, and with a few exceptions caused by human frailty. He's talking about people who stole from the corpses gold teeth and whatever, and were disciplined for it. With a few exceptions, we have remained decent. That has made us hard, sometimes translated great. That is a page of glory in our history that has never been told and is never to be told. I'll say something that I don't think I've ever mentioned. Just can't think of the name. Sam Ervin of the Watergate hearings, in charge of them and so forth, once said to me when I was giving a briefing to him, "You are innocent, are you not?" And I hesitated on that. Innocent, me, with the life I'd lived in the Pentagon? And I hesitated, and he looked at me piercingly, and I said, I am not guilty of the charges I am charged with. But a poem that was brought to me, actually, I think via Ray McGovern, who's on this now, and came from Camilo Mejia, for whom I testified when he tried to be a conscientious objector for refusing to go back to Iraq. I met his family and failed. Yet they failed to give him CO status, even though he was in prison at the time. But Ray introduced me to the fact that he had put out a poem, a translation, and I got a new translation made, of a poem by Albrecht Haushofer, whose family had been, on the first place, an inspiration to Hitler, the father, for Drive to the East, for world politics and whatnot, but who had felt that Hitler was greatly abusing this approach and actually been associated with Hess. They were suspected for that. But Albrecht had been in the Foreign Service as well as a playwright in town. He actually took part as a courier in the plot in 1944 against Hitler and was captured by the SS, put in prison. His execution was delayed because a bomb destroyed all the records in his courtroom. But 2 weeks before the end of the war in Europe, he and others were taken out of their Moabit prison near Berlin, taken over by the SS to a nearby field and shot. No trial. And his brother, who learned that where he was, this had happened, came looking for him the next day. It was very cold, despite it being near the end of the war. He was found, his brother, in a greatcoat with his hand inside his coat, and inside a batch of poems, sonnets, all sonnets that he had written in prison. And one of them is these: Guilt, Schuld. I bear lightly what the court calls my guilt. To plot and to conspire. I would have been a criminal had I not taken that as my duty for my people's future. Yet I am guilty, but not the way you think. I should have recognized my duty sooner. I should more sharply have named evil as evil. I kept my judgment to myself far too long. In my heart, I accuse myself. I have long betrayed my conscience. I have lied to myself and lied to others. I knew early on the whole road of misery. I gave warning, not strong and clear enough. Today I know what I was guilty of. When I ended my speech 50 years ago in May, I talked about Albert Speer, who said years later in his book, if I was isolated, I determined the degree of my own isolation. If I was ignorant, I ensured my own ignorance. If I did not see, it was because I did not want to see. In my own eyes, there is no way I can avoid responsibility for the extermination of the Jews. I was as much their executioner as Himmler. Because they were carried past me to their deaths and I did not see, it is surprisingly easy to blind your moral eyes. I was like a man following a trail of blood-stained footprints through the snow without realizing someone has been injured. And in this chapter, that's pretty much where the speech ends. But in the chapter, I found that I wrote a year later, I gave my reaction as I was reading that at the community church. I found my voice halting because at first I was imagining that McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Dean Rusk, and the presidents they served were listening. But I told my hearers, I am finding this difficult to read. After a moment, I went on, but I brought the talk to an end. There were tears coming to my eyes. I knew that it was I myself who was the listener, my eyes, my voice responding to these indictments. I was there too, however minor and innocuous my role. Quote, my moral failure, Speer says, is not a matter of this item or that. It resides in my active association with the whole course of events. That accusation and the more specific one of willful, irresponsible ignorance and neglect of human consequences are truths I must live with, as should any American official known to me who has been associated with Vietnam. A year after saying that, I was writing a piece about the ongoing invasion of Laos earlier, and which ended. It came out in the New York Review of Books. I quoted the fact that when the invasion began, the president had no cameras with the invasion, no embedded reporters, no reporting at all about the invasion. Instead, he gave a press release on his message on ecology, a word we'd hardly heard at that time. Beginning, in his tragedy, Murder in the Cathedral, T.S. Eliot wrote, clean the air, clean the sky, wash the wind. He misspells Eliot in the press release, and the quote is slightly wrong. I have proposed to the Congress a sweeping and comprehensive program to do just that and more, to end the plunder of America's natural heritage. And actually that was. Nixon did more on that is now being drastically undone, has been in last days here by Trump. Nixon was far more liberal than his Democratic successors in domestic matters and on these environmental matters now. But as my son pointed out to me when I read that to him and I was writing this piece, he started saying by heart the actual quotation from Eliot. And let me say, we heard from Dean Stevens today all the things that have happened on December 13th. Well, one of those is my oldest son's birthday. This is his birthday, and I started the day at 6:30 a.m. getting up, which is not my wont, to wish him happy birthday. He was 13. He's 65 today. He was 13 when he helped me copy the Pentagon Papers. And he did that because I had asked him whether he wanted to, having gotten him to read Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, which includes the line, cast your whole vote, not a piece of paper merely, but your whole influence. And I wanted him to, if he wanted, to be part of doing something that I thought he might have to do someday himself. Well, I found Robert then, later, 3 years later, the war was going on. He was approaching draft age, which he turned in his draft cards. That the actual Eliot quote is about murder. It's not about ecology or the wind. It's about the murder of the Archbishop being done in the presence of others. Horror, it's a chorus from the chorus. Hearted as the murders being done for reasons of state. And here is the quote. Clear the air, clean the sky, wash the wind, take stone from stone and wash them. The land is foul, the water is foul, our beasts and ourselves defiled with blood. A rain of blood has blinded my eyes. How can I ever return to the soft, quiet seasons? Night, stay with us, stop sun, hold moon. Let the day not come, let the spring not come. Can I look again at the day and its common things and see them all smeared with blood through a curtain of falling blood? As I've said, I was reading this as Nixon was invading, I was writing this as he was invading Laos. As I believe that 50 years later, our still present incumbent president wants to attack Iran. and is, in fact, in a war that has lasted in Afghanistan 19 years, which I think Vietnam could have done without an almost miraculous set of events that led to Nixon's being out of office and made the war endable. 19 years. Trump, for whatever reasons, has been saying he wants to end that and get all the troops out. He is opposed by the masked establishment, Democratic and Republican and Pentagon, in response. And moreover, is supported. He's supporting his alliance with Saudi Arabia and its war against Yemen and so forth. Okay, Eliot said, in life there is not time to grieve long, but this, the murder of the Archbishop, this is out of life. This is out of time, an instant eternity of evil and wrong. To sum up the title that I gave this speech, The Road to Doomsday, Endless Wars and Insane Nuclear Policy Since the Pentagon Papers. The answer is, of course, there has been no diminution in these wars. In fact, they have gone on longer than the largest part of the Vietnam War, although that was better regarded as a 30 years war involving the US, just as Afghanistan really involves going back to 1979, when Brzezinski and Carter took steps that they thought and succeeded in involving the Soviets, provoking a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which would give them their Vietnam, and which did do that. They didn't lose as many as we did in Vietnam, but the Afghans did. Perhaps 1 million people killed in that war, provoked by us deliberately. 79, that's 41 years ago. So that war has been going on, and Trump is being currently prevented from ending it, and can go on for another 19 years. I said at that time in 71, these lines are almost unbearable for an American to read in the year 1971, after the last 6 years. 6 years, the war had 4 years to go still. If we were ever to return to the soft, quiet seasons, and we have not earned an easy passage. And then a passage, this entire speech that I gave, and I've gone on longer here, but the entire speech could be read today about our current policies, both nuclear and non-nuclear, with only place names changed. If we were ever to get back to the soft, quiet seasons, enough Americans, something that McGovern proposed that year in 72, when I wrote that, come home, America. And he lost every state but Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. And has kept people from making such propositions ever since. If we're to do that, enough Americans must look past options, briefings, pros and cons, to see what is being done in their name and to refuse to be accomplices. But that's a change in the people. If that's to happen, if the mutiny is to happen, it's not just the former officials or the actual officials like myself that have to be mutinied against, as I was describing earlier. We have to transcend, to transform our demands that we make on our leaders and our representatives in Congress and our courts, and of ourselves and our neighbors and our children and our parents. And to change those demands, that has to change. Can humans do that? Individuals, groups, even nations? Yes, we've seen it. There is compassion, truth, altruism, sacrifice, courage, all these things, which are also as part of humanity as war and slavery and torture, and which will, so humans do change and do act against these other injustices. Can humanity change in time? And here, climate here, as well as war and nuclear war? We don't know. So we don't know it can't. It's not impossible. I'm not here indicating that it's easy or even likely. I think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. Humans have done it, and we can. And I said they must recognize and force the president to act upon the moral proposition that the US must stop killing people in Indochina in 71. We didn't do that till 75. That neither the lives we have lost nor the lives we have taken give the US any right to determine by fire and air power who shall govern or who shall die in Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, or Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Iraq, Libya. That is not in the process of changing with the change in government that we expect will take place on January. We have now cast our paper ballots merely and to good effect. It was essential in those electoral activities to remove the president who is still proclaiming this month with the belief of tens of millions of Americans that he won the election a month ago, and that fire and fury can be threatened against Korea, that the Iran and so forth. We removed him, but it remains to cast our whole vote, our whole influence, and now the target of that must be the Biden administration. So it is up to us. All of these memories can be brought to bear. The war did end and would not have ended in 75 without a lot of people doing things that were out of the ordinary to use their whole influence and bring it to an end. And that did happen. And the doomsday machines still exist, still totally wrong, as much as anything in human history or more. And it's up to us to change that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Daniel Ellsberg. Thank you so much. You could have gone on and on. We're just so honored to have you here. We're going to hear one last number from Tim Ray and Dan Greenspan, but I'm going to first make a little pitch here. This is our beautiful collection basket. This is the old style kind that you can add, or else you can go to our website, or you can send a check. This is my pile of worthy causes that need my attention this holiday season, and I have just as many at home. Just as a way to remind you that you received this newsletter in the mail, I hope. If not, we can send you one. And it has an envelope in it. We need your help to continue this project. 100 years have gone by and Community Church is still here, vibrant, alive, and help us make this thing happen. I want to tell you real quickly that you can hear Dan's address today on our YouTube channel, and you can hear his address from 49 years ago on our SoundCloud page. Charlie has put the link up in the chat section. So let's thank Dan Greenspan and Tim Ray for joining us here. We are proud that we believe in cultural work that needs to be sponsored and hosted at Community Church of Boston. We have wonderful music every Sunday, and this is no exception. Thank you again, Dan Greenspan and Tim Ray, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dean, for having us. We're really glad, as always, to be back and part of this great anniversary of the Community Church of Boston. We're going to finish with a song by Kenny Wheeler, a great jazz trumpet player. This is called Heyoki.
Thank you, Tim Ray and Dan Greenspan. I miss live music. I wish you could all be here to enjoy and take in the depth of the elegance and grace of these two players right next to me. It brings tears to my eyes. We have an award to give you, Daniel Ellsberg. But first I want to take a quick pause to do one more commercial, which is that we're doing at Community Church. It's a lonely place, but it took in all of my crafts from Central America, which are being sold. We're having Zoom Bazaar right here. Let me give you some examples. This is the work of a crafts cooperative in a town called Teocinte, Chalatenango, El Salvador. Placemats, set of 6. Wallets. This cloth is hand sewn in Guatemala. Here's a little iPad case, I call it, with a strap. Here is a fanny pack. Beautiful colors from Sololá region of Lake Atitlan, Guatemala. Here's a toiletry kit. Here's a book bag. Here's a backpack, all kinds of stuff. Now we go to embroidery. This is my friend Maribel in another town called El Higueral, and she makes these. I bring them stock, and she embroiders them for me, and we have them for sale in pink and black. And here's all kinds of items that I buy at thrift stores. Boomerangs is my favorite one. And I get this stuff and take it to El Salvador, and Niña Hilda in El Higueral and her 3 daughters do the embroidery for me. And we got all kinds of this stuff, and we're doing Zoom craft shows, benefits completely 100% of cost to these women who do beautiful work in El Salvador. Above cost, it's a complete benefit for Community Church of Boston. We've already sold about $1,000, so that's $400 for Community Church. We're in a tough place with the virus and the effect on the restaurant down below, and also with our need for new HVAC.
You
So,
shouldn't wear
thank you.
that mask.
One
It's
more.
very unhealthy.
One more.
Yeah,
Please mute yourself.
like
This
you
is the
can't
last
breathe
one.
properly.
This is the
And
last
you
one.
know, it
These
could
are,
collect mold and bacteria.
um,
You're a lot more likely to get sick wearing that thing. Yeah.
these are ceramic pigs from Ilobasco. We're having Zoom sessions every day. And now I hand over the microphone to Ray McGovern, who was with us earlier this year on an address that you can find on our YouTube channel. And Ray wants to say a few more words in honor of Daniel Ellsberg and in preface to the conferring of the award. Ray, you are unmuted.
Okay. Thank you, Gene, and thank you, Dan. I'll be very brief. I have been advertising this book as the best book, the most important book that I've ever read. It's called The Doomsday Machine, and thankfully, I need not explain what's in it anymore, since Dan has done so eloquently. Dan also mentioned how close we've come to annihilating our planet. And one vignette in this book, which reads like a novel. It's not very long. It's 300 plus pages, but there's a vignette there. And if you too cheap to buy the book, go to the library and look up in the index, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, Navy captain, Soviet Navy, who is personally responsible for the fact that we can all be here today. He did something not insane by refusing to allow the launch of nuclear torpedoes at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, you know, talk about civilian control of the military. Well, he was the equivalent. He was the party boss, and they needed his okay. So that's a current concern we have, but look at that. Now, the other thing I'd like to say simply is that in addition to all the things that have been said about Dan, one needs to know that Dan is a mensch. Huh? I'd like to address Dan, the human. He's not only got courage, not only got faithfulness and justice galore, but he's a real human, okay? And how do I know that? Well, I've known Dan for a long time now. At one point, about 10 years ago, a couple of my grandchildren and I went over to be hosted a wonderful brunch by Patricia, Dan's wife, and Dan. I asked my daughter, who was with us that day, to comment on what went on. And this is what she said. I want to make sure that I don't misquote her. Not only was Dan fascinating to talk to regarding political matters, it was interesting to see him with the kids and how much he cared about what they thought and what the future generation thought of what was going on. He is a caring and kind person, in addition to being endlessly curious about the world. What a wonderfully impressive combination. Well, that's Dan. Now, as far as religion is concerned, Dan is not real big on religion, as most people know. But you know what? I think of Kirk Vonnegut when I think about Dan. And when Kirk was asked, you know, Kirk, what do you think about, you know, you're a humanist and, you know, agnostic or whatever. What do you think about Jesus of Nazareth? And Kirk said, you know, I don't know if he was God's son or not, but If it weren't for the Sermon on the Mount, I'd just as soon be a cockroach. Well, there you have it. The other thing I'd say, just to tack on here, is that I saw Father Dan Berrigan a couple months before he died. And I told him that I just talked with Dan Ellsberg, and he knows Dan quite well from spending many days in prison or jail with him. I said, Dan, Father Dan, would you have anything to say to Dan Ellsberg? I'll pass it along. And Berrigan was very frail. He had a raspy voice, but his eyes lit up. And he said, yeah, tell him he did the right thing. I mean, that says it all, right? Dan, you did the right thing. And you're an example to all of us. And I am happy to say that you're my friend, but you're also my example. Thanks for being here. And thanks for being so eloquent today and sharing those wonderful thoughts about where we are. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. I urge you all to go to our YouTube channel and hear Ray's remarks at Community Church back in May, whenever it was. This award we confer today in honor and in deep beloved memory of Robert Datilio. Robert had approximately a 50-year relationship with Community Church of Boston. There's a newsletter article that he wrote in 1971, same year that Dan spoke here. Bob was consumed with the Sacco and Vanzetti case in a very deep way and knew more about every detail of that case than probably anybody on the planet. Bob passed on November 19th, and his ashes are right here in repository at the church underneath our, I have to share this screen, underneath our plaque. Can you see the plaque? I hope you can, because it's a beautiful piece of art, and Bob had everything to do with getting a casting of it and knew everything about the really mysterious history of this plaque. The author is Gutzon Borglund, who also did that sacrilege of a statue on Mount Rushmore. And this is his tribute to Sacco and Vanzetti, and this is a quote from Vanzetti. What I wish more than all in the last hour of agony is that our case and our fate may be understood in their real being and serve as a tremendous lesson to the forces of freedom, that our suffering and death will not have been in vain. Those are some of the last words of Vanzetti. And again, we remember Bob Datilio as we confer this award to you, Dan Ellsberg. His ashes are over under the actual, this was just a PDF of the actual plaque, which is on the wall at Community Church. It was lost for a long time, the original, and then it came to be in our lobby right around then, the early 70s, and then it went to the Boston Public Library, but we got a casting of it in aluminum. And there's quite a history to that plaque, and Bob's eternal lifelong wish was that there be a casting of it installed in the North End. And that is something that we will continue to work to make happen. It's not easy. Public art is difficult, especially when it's controversial. When there's anything controversial about it, but we will continue. There is a Sacco Vanzetti Memorial Society that pursues this wish, and Sergio Reyes is with us on this call, who was very active with them. Maybe we will hear from him if we have time, but actually, in a way, time is not of consequence because the union isn't telling us to shut down, and we can hear more from everybody. But first, we just want to show you, Dan and everybody in presence here, that this is the award. We haven't put it in a frame yet, and we haven't gotten Charlie Welch, who is our president and also our sound engineer on this call, to sign this document, and we will send it to you with a couple of other items, Dan. One is some Black Lives Matter postcards from our beloved Bennett Hammond, who will be addressing us on December 22nd and playing music with us on the theme of solstice. And we will also send you a copy of this poster, which is designed by our beloved publications and office manager, Crystal Rollins Jackson. It says, "Say their names," and it's a picture of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And down at the bottom, it says Black Lives Matter, and it has all their names. Not all of them, but enough of them so you get the idea. So, thank you, Daniel Ellsberg. Hey, Dan, I got a question, a personal question. Do you drink coffee?
I drink green tea on days like this when I have early and talk, not coffee. Why?
How about your son who has a birthday?
Yeah, fine. Yes, he does.
Okay, you will get a pound of the. I in addition to be administrator and bottle washer at Community Church of Boston, am a importer of fine coffee from El Salvador, and part of your framed Community Church Award will be a pound of coffee, which, by the way, is available to all the rest of you either by mail order or by personal delivery in the upcoming days, during the holidays especially. Luis Guzman, our cook, and I will be going on a tamale frenzy in the early part of this week, and we will be delivering tamales to a whole bunch of members of Community Church as a gift to you in this season, this bizarre, strange season. So let's open the floor to questions. Leonard Lerman, who also knows a lot about Sacco and Vanzetti, in fact, wrote an opera about them, and who knew Bob and worked with Bob Datilio very closely, has asked for the floor. Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dean. Thank you, Mr. Ellsberg, for all that you have done. And I want to talk a little bit about Sacco and Vanzetti and Bob Datilio and Mark Blitzstein, whose work I've completed, and a man that you knew very well, better than I, although I considered him a very dear friend. He was a very strong supporter of Mark Blitzstein and of my work on Mark Blitzstein, and that's Leonard Boudin. I want to say hi to Nate Goldschlag, who's on this call. He's a member of my Harvard class of 71, and he put his body on the line and was expelled from Harvard for protesting the Vietnam War. I wasn't expelled, but I certainly supported him and others who did. And I did several productions of works for Bernstein and Brecht and Blitzstein, Brecht's Days of the Commune. And Leonard Boudin was a very, very strong supporter of all of those things. He was a very close friend of Mark Blitzstein, and I valued his friendship immensely. And I used to call him my namesake, or he called me his namesake. And well, of course, his grandson is now the district attorney in San Francisco, and we're in touch with him constantly. And I interviewed his son-in-law, David Gilbert, in prison for Jewish currents. But what I remember most vividly, Leonard Boudin told me that he thought he would probably be most remembered as the man who got Paul Robeson's passport back. But I remember him even more vividly for a speech that he gave in the courtroom defending you, Mr. Ellsberg. And I don't remember the speech exactly, and I've tried to find it online and I can't find it, but maybe you can help me find it, or maybe you remember it better than I do. It was a speech that was so dynamic, it could have come out of the dramas of Sacco and Vanzetti and Emma Goldman and the Rosenbergs, or for that matter, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. These are all the same struggles against the Espionage Act. But what I remember that I believe that Leonard Boudin said is when it was revealed that your psychiatrist's office had been broken into by the plumbers, that he said to the judge, "This case has now become not what the government has done to us. It's because not what we have done to the government, but what the government has done to us."
I haven't eaten. Oh my God.
Judith, would you?
Yes.
So, Mr. Ellsberg, do you remember that speech in detail, and can you help me find it? I would love to put it on my wall.
Well, I'll look for it, but I know at this moment I can't add to that. No, go ahead.
But you do.
Yeah, well, we certainly we moved for when that came out for that the White House had sent people in to burglarize my former psychoanalyst files. We moved for an end to the trial, but that did not, in fact, lead. It went on for another couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, and was mentioned by the judge in the end, though, for a pattern of events which offended a sense of justice, he said. And of course, that's what Sacco and Vanzetti's trial moved the world to see, was a set of trial procedures that offended a sense of justice and that led to the deaths of these men. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sergio has a question, but I think he needs to leave, and I'm just going to read it. And it goes like this. Sergio Reyes joins us from way down southern Chile, and Sergio, who is an important part of the Sacco Vanzetti Commemoration Society. And the question is as follows: I wonder what connection Daniel makes with Sacco and Vanzetti, who understood that First World War was not workers' war, but rather a war for markets, as the Second World War also was, and the Third World War currently in progress is also.
I was just reading about Sacco and Vanzetti as a result of this honor, and found that the judge, of course, held it, and the jury and the public held it against them that they had gone to Mexico to avoid the draft in 1917 for the First World War, in part as anarchists who did perceive that correctly as an imperial war. They came back. I read in the course of reading all that actually their particular concern was that they felt that in connection with the war, that anarchists like themselves would be rounded up and deported, sent out of the country, actually to the war zone, as that actually took place after the war, essentially, even though Eugene Debs was a hero of theirs and who supported their cause and ran for president and got, I think, millions of votes in prison for opposing the draft, basically, during that war. You know, looking back on that, it is outrageous. The first draft here since the Civil War was enacted to send people to that war. Actually, it's amazing. As, for example, Australia was very concerned when I put out the Pentagon Papers because it revealed that they had in effect enacted the draft in Australia to get people to partake in the Vietnam War. You know, a totally unjust war. Outrageous actions which hurt, they said, our relations or their political standing in Australia. And I thought, good, actually, that's the point of these papers, is to hold people accountable for such outrage. Yes, what I have said here is, of course, these wars, these internal wars that are going on in the Middle East that have led to 37 million refugees in this course of this since George W. Bush and Obama and Trump have been fought basically in connection with access to oil. And here we're talking about using Boeing and others. And notice we have just sent B-52s, the nuclear bomber, to the area of Iran as a direct threat. And let me emphasize something that I said earlier. In context, I was part of a conspiracy to provoke and to take part in aggressive war in Vietnam. I was part of that. If, as I said, or as Joe, I think, said, I had occasion to announce at a meeting on war crimes in the Congress that here I was sitting there as a potential defendant in a war crimes trial. And that was actually true. Well, within a month of my coming to work in the Pentagon, my boss, John McNaughton, and others were drafting in September of 1964 plans for provoking North Vietnam into actions that would appear to justify our waging air war against North Vietnam. This was participated in by the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, virtually all the officials were involved in this conspiracy. I was reading it and not telling Congress, so I was party to that conspiracy too. I have little doubt that at this moment there are similar, nowadays, electronic files, perhaps pieces of paper even as well, about measures that this administration, before it leaves office in the next month, can provoke Iran into actions that will justify the use of those B-52s in non-nuclear attacks. And someone's holding up, of course, our support of Israeli illegal occupation in the West Bank and elsewhere, and in Gaza, the very long, talk about endless occupation of Gaza. All of these efforts, yes, have to do with imperial motives, like those that the makers of B-52s and NIAs are involved, but in particular, they are pressed by Exxon, Aramco, Chevron, the other major oil companies, who are the obstacles and the disinformers that are betraying humanity by pressing the maximum use of fossil fuels to a point that, again, threatens our civilization just as does the maintenance of the Doomsday machine. And again, we see, in effect, I'm saying the denial that is not merely generated by our officials, but accepted and participated in by a vast part of our public. Denial of the dangers of a doomsday machine on the one hand, a state of denial, because in the doomsday machine, it doesn't even come up for debate. And then in the climate issue, denial both of the reality of it and of the arguments that are made publicly. And here is one place where Biden may actually respond to our using our whole vote. This is an area where he's put in people who may actually move in the direction that Greta Thunberg and others and the millions of young people who have followed her example and in striking, nonviolent strike against this, may actually lead to our recognizing this as an emergency after all. So the perception of Sacco and Vanzetti as anarchists at that point of the nature of World War I absolutely does apply to the ongoing wars of the last decades, 30 years, and the potential war against humanity of a nuclear doomsday machine. Okay. Stephen, I think that's enough on that answer, long enough. Are we still, I might, since our moderator may have moved on.
Now I'm back.
What? There we
Now
go.
I'm back. I'm sorry. We got cut off and I had to come back in and I lost the chat and there's a bunch of good questions in there. But one of them wanted us to mention, I think it's John Amadon, wanted us to mention the Ploughshares, 2 who are going to prison on Monday. John, maybe you might talk to us about that as I cannot read it off the screen. John Amadon, where are you? Go ahead, John.
I'm here. Yeah,
Go ahead.
You. The Kings Bay Ploughshare Act, I'm trying. The Kings Bay Ploughshare activists went on to the base in Georgia, down in Georgia, and really exposed the Trident submarines and the awesome and thoroughly illegal destructive capacity that they have. There were 7 of them. They went on trial and were convicted of conspiracy. And Martha Hennessy and Carmen Trotta were just ordered to report to prison this Monday. But Liz McAllister, Father Steve Kelly, Patrick O'Neill, and there's several others, 7 total. Claire Grady, and I'm not sure who the last one is off the top of my head right now, but anyway, they have all spent time in prison and or will be going to prison. Well, Mark Colville from Connecticut is the last one. So I just wanted to bring since we're discussing nuclear weapons, I just wanted to bring attention to them because they have really put their lives on the line. They are being sent to prison in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and it is a very threatening situation. And of course, they are innocent, and nuclear weapons are thoroughly illegal, even and will be declared so very soon by international law, the new treaty. So thank you so much.
Dan, any response?
Yes, I was very honored by this particular action because they carried on to the base along with vials of their own blood, which they used on some of the replicas of the Trident submarine. My book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. They left the copy on the base, and I hope that people there did read it, although it was brought up for as evidence in the trial of what they're littering the base actually was literally, that's part of it, the traitors there. But they actually, on the basis of their having been, as they said, partly inspired by the book, of course, all of these people had been protesting long before my book came out, but they did quote it in their statements. And so on that basis, they wanted me, and I was very anxious to be expert witness in their trial, testifying to my knowledge of the fact, my whole talk here today on the point. And in fact, I said how wrong and insane were the instruments of omnicide, which they were protesting, but also illegal and unconstitutional in the threats that were being made and the risks and so forth. But I was not allowed to testify, which means that they no more had a fair trial in terms of ability to bring witnesses to why they had done this and what the crimes were and wrongs that they were protesting. They no matter had a fair trial than Sacco and Vanzetti, or Julian Assange could have if he were here. Joe Gerson mentioned earlier, I think, the fact that my trial was the first prosecution on the Espionage Act for someone who would get information to the American public. That was the first trial of a former official. There were 2 after me before Obama, and then Obama had 9 such trials, and Trump even more than that. But Trump, there is now a person facing extradition. A judgment which will be made in England on January 5th, Julian Assange, who's the first member of the press, not as a source, but the first journalist to be indicted under Trump. And if he is extradited, he will not be the last. And under Biden as well. In fact, it was Biden who called him at the time of the revelations a high-tech terrorist, as did others. And others have been talking about execution of such people, like the spree of executions that is taking place right at this moment under Attorney General Barr while he's filmed there. So all these actions of protests like that of the Ploughshares 8, or I think it was 7, I've of course supported very strongly. I think that nothing less than that should be done. They're also entirely right, in my opinion, in acting non-violently and truthfully. And I think that violence in reaction, which some think of as raising the stakes and being more powerful, in fact plays into the hands of those who want to maintain the status quo of threat and danger with force, and will do it. So I think the reaction has to be nonviolent, like the Ploughshares people represent entirely. And of course, as Assange and Ed Snowden and Chelsea Manning and others represent, Tom Drake, Frank Greville in England, Catherine Gunn in England, the possibility of averting war and violence by being honest and telling the truth in a way I did not do when I could have in 1961 or 1964 or 5. Interestingly, on this 50th anniversary in May of 23rd, I was just looking at that speech, I noticed, and it was 3 weeks earlier that I was getting maced and clubbed and whatnot in Washington on May Day, along with my affinity group, largely from Boston, Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and Marilyn Young, and Frank, a few others, several others, Mitchell Goodman, the wife of Denise Levertov, the husband of Denise Levertov. 3 days later, getting arrested and beaten, actually, while Howard Zinn was arrested at the Federal Building in Boston. So that was just weeks before that community church speech. And of course, the Pentagon Papers came out 3 weeks later. So I clearly am one who believes that nonviolent, truthful resistance is essential. It gives us no guarantee, not even a high likelihood of changing this, but a possibility. It's necessary, I think, not sufficient, but necessary in awakening the public at large to the fact we are, as Americans and even as humans in a larger sense, participants in evil, which is occurring right now, to the extent that we willfully remain ignorant when we could be when we fail to resist, when we fail to expose, when we fail to tell the truth. Everybody does that to some extent in support of us as distinct from them. And unless we can enlarge that we group, that us, to include all humans, because all humans are put at risk by what we and our corporations and our presidents are doing in respect to carbon dioxide and in respect to invoking nuclear winter. Unless we mutiny against that, which has not occurred on a mass scale, on an individual scale, then the human species will not have the chance to be transformed.
Thank you, Dan. Ken Casanova, if you unmute yourself, did you have a question? There you are.
Yeah.
Hi, Ken.
It's obviously the big important question.
Still can't hear you.
Hello?
Can hear.
Hello?
It says you're unmuted.
He is unmuted, I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Now it says, try
We can
now.
hear him, Dean.
Hello?
No,
We can hear you.
not getting you, Ken.
Okay, I guess other people can
Let's
hear
figure
me.
this-
I can hear him.
There's nothing. Let's figure this out while.
I can
while
hear you.
take,
I can hear him.
I can
David-
hear him.
David Roll, do you have your,
No.
your hand up?
Dean, you're the only one who can't hear me.
David? Okay.
Can
Let's
you
keep
hear me?
trying.
But Ken,
There's,
I could hear
Phil
Ken.
Nichols.
Ken, you should go ahead.
had a
Yeah, I'll
question.
go ahead.
You will unmute yourself.
I'll ask my question. It's the biggest question and it's the important question, but how we could begin to answer it, I really don't know. Right now, the Biden administration, we have to deal with that for the next 4 years, presumably, unless, of course, he becomes incapacitated, and then it'll be Kamala Harris. And they're basically not going to be any different than the past administrations in terms of nuclear madness. The question is, can they be moved in any way? And presumably that's going to take some kind of mass movement on this issue, perhaps similar to the nuclear freeze movement. How that would happen in these times, I have no idea. And then in the future, we have to have, in order to change anything along the lines of what's been spoken about, we were going to have an administration that has a different policy point of view towards nuclear weapons and to the endless wars. And that's going to take having an electoral party committed to those kinds of changes, which of course does not presently exist. And either the Democratic Party has to be radically reformed, or there'll have to be a third party that comes out of the remnants of all of these bad policies across the whole spectrum. So those are the thoughts I've been having since I've been listening. So I don't know if there's any comment that could be made on that.
Okay, shall I comment on that? Yes. I've said that I think violence, I feel sure, if I feel I've learned anything, sure, it's that violent resistance plays into the hands of those who basically keep the system of armed us versus them in place, and of proceeding by threat and armed action in various cases. Another approach that I believe is a dead end in the US, not elsewhere, is third parties, for the reason that I've studied for quite a while, especially since 2000, that as even Howie Hawkins, the Green Party candidate this year, said to me, the US is the most doggedly two-party system in the world. And that's a pretty sound statement. How exactly he justified, and the Green Party justified, encouraging people not to vote for Biden, I don't really understand. You were right, Ken, I believe, in my opinion, saying that in foreign policy and defense policy, we have no basis for expecting a big difference between even the Trump administration or the Republicans with their denial and their close to an open insanity in terms of climate and the election and pandemic and so forth. But in terms of foreign policy, if anything, on the question of Afghanistan, I would like to see Trump in the next month do something extraordinary, and that is order us out of Afghanistan, not because that's the best way of getting out or the most prudent, or there will have no harm. There will be harm to people in doing that. I don't see us ceasing to kill people in Afghanistan for the next 19 years unless this president, who is the first who's come along, who for some reason wants to get out of there, does it. It would have to be accompanied, I think, by massive emigration of women from Kabul who will be not only disadvantaged, but probably oppressed otherwise. They should be able to come out of Afghanistan into this country or elsewhere, and with our support. But we should not continue to support women's rights in Afghanistan, which are at danger from the Taliban and from the warlords, by killing Afghans. We have no right. We never had right to kill Afghans for this or other reasons, and we don't now, and we won't. So there is a case where Trump is less unlikely to do that than his successors. One other point, I am still hoping for the next month that Trump will pardon Assange, because I don't see his life ceasing to be threatened by his solitary confinement in England, other than by Trump. And the only reason I can think of Trump for doing it is because nothing would anger and irritate Hillary Clinton more. And I think that is an actual possibility that Trump might do that. Otherwise, Assange will stay into his death, which might not be very prolonged, and set the example to all newsmen in the world, but especially in America, of the end of the First Amendment, with regard even to freedom of the press. That's the sources. So anyway, here are the 2 points on foreign policy and nuclear policy that are closest to my heart. How could I then have urged people to vote for Biden? People have asked me that. And the answer is very simply that in our two-party system, which is going to remain a two-party system for reasons I won't go into this month, but I urge you to look up what makes a two-party system on the web. What is a two-party system? You'll find it's the US above all, with our single district, winner-take-all, non-proportional representation and so forth, and our history and our precedent. So what does that leave? Yes, transforming the Democratic Party. The change from Trump, I will say, for domestic reasons and constitutional reasons, and remaining a democracy, was essential, was necessary, and had to happen. And fortunately, has just happened. And frankly, I would see no basis for hope for the next 4 years, or perhaps forever, on climate with another 4 years of Trump. I don't believe we would have anything that looks like a democracy within 4 more years of Trump, as we're seeing, by the way, this month. Clearly, a lot of authoritarian-minded voters are accepting Trump's versions on anything, to the point of saying he won the election. Now, they are getting that from Fox News, which they watch all the time. And how will you change them from that? Fox News is not crazy enough even for Trump at this point, so he's going to compete with them. We have to get the word to even these people and to other people that this system must change. And it's not only the doomsday machines. And let me say this. The doomsday machines are not only in the service of Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon and the congressmen they keep in office with their jobs that they offer and their votes and their donations. It is also a system of alliances which, for our economic benefit, not for our security, led by NATO, in which the basis of our leadership, quote, leadership of that alliance is our protectorate over Europe. From what? With the Warsaw Pact having dissolved, with the Soviet Union having dissolved. For almost nobody can imagine a threat from the remaining forces of Russia, except the Baltics and Poland. And they are insisting on this case of being protected the way Berlin has been always protected for the last 50 years, by threatening to blow the world up. Actually, Poland and the Baltics should be made aware of a new policy, which Biden is not proposing. And that is, we will not initiate Poland. We will defend your interests and our interests and everyone else's interests by means other than threatening or preparing to cause nuclear winter. That should happen, but that takes pressure. And the pressure has to come on the Democratic Party to transform it. Is that impossible? No, I think that the Democrats have shown, for example, on climate. Biden himself was pressed during the campaign to take a much stronger, by people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC, to take a much stronger position on climate. And here is one where they actually do seem to be showing some response. Will it be adequate? No. I say that it's pretty strong, unless they're really willing to take on the fossil fuel companies to the extent of keeping the fossil fuel in the ground, then we're heading for catastrophe. But there are degrees of catastrophe, and we can at least head for the least to avoid the worst of them, basically. But that is worthwhile. I'm going on here, but I'm reminded of Joe having asked me, he said long ago, he said, what is it like to be a Jewish Marine? And he implies that he said, I wasn't a Jewish Marine. Of course, I was a Jewish Marine. As my father, who was a Christian Scientist, and my mother was a Christian Scientist, always said, we're Jews, but not in religion. They're in Christian Scientists. And but there was no question I was a Christian Marine. You mentioned my friend Dan Berrigan. I was really pleased to hear his last words of that's wonderful to hear from Beyond the Grave here from Dan Berrigan. But I always knew that he thought I'd done the right thing. But I love that it was he gave that response. But I once asked him, I said, Dan, how did you come to be a pacifist as you are? And I wasn't, and am not a total pacifist with looking at one war that I can think of. World War II, with all its imperial objectives, I believe that it was the right thing to oppose Hitler's troops in Russia and elsewhere violently. And that keeps me from being a total pacifist. But Dan was, and many of my associates are. So I said, Dan, how did you become a pacifist? He said, oh, it was very natural for me. He said, I'm a Catholic. I said, are you kidding? I said, nearly every colleague of mine in OCs in the Marines was a Catholic. In the Marine Corps, I was the Jewish. I wasn't less of a Cold Warrior there were, but there certainly was no problem there being Catholic, and so here we have a Pope at last, who is taking a different position, that even the possession and threat of nuclear war is wrong, is an evil, and can the possession of a doomsday machine be other than evil? Can it be a lesser evil? No, not really. There is nothing that says this justifies, under any circumstances, under conditions, the doomsday machine. So you don't have to be Catholic or Jewish. Oh, a last thing on the Democratic Party. When George Bush used to say that God had told him to invade Iraq, he said that in so many words. Why did he invade Iraq? God told him to oppose Saddam Hussein and so forth. And I used to say to audiences, when you hear a voice telling you to invade a country that is no threat to us, get a second opinion. I said that wasn't God for me. But also in those days, I used to say, as a Jew who opposes Netanyahu, as I still do, and Likud, Trump boasted of being their best friend, but Biden is no opponent of Netanyahu. Said, as a Jew opposing Netanyahu and Likud and Greater Israel and their occupation of Gaza, I'm going to be called a self-hating Jew, as I have been. I said, that rolls off my back. That's ridiculous. Not because I'm not a Jew. Self-hating Jew? No. But if someone called me a self-hating Democrat, I would find that harder to refute. And that's generally true. We did not get the Democrat here that I would have liked to see, that gave us a real chance, like Bernie or Elizabeth Warren or AOC. But on the other hand, I do look forward to AOC's becoming of age for the presidency in October of 2024. So there is a chance to change this party. They are more open to change, to pressure from us, than the Republicans ever would be, which doesn't at all guarantee it. But I think we've got now what we need to have as an arena of struggle that offers some genuine promise.
David. Hi, David.
Hi, Dean. Thank you. I hope I'm okay. I hope people can hear me. So I'm only 53, so I didn't see this speech 50 years ago, but I saw you, Daniel Ellsberg, speak at the Cambridge Friends Meeting House like at least 10 years ago, and it was a very similar speech about doomsday and the dangers of nuclear weapons. I think you were even more. It was even more pessimistic. I remember, like, you said that the nuclear weapons will destroy all life on Earth many times, and now you're saying like some people may survive. But the point I want to make is different. Like, I feel like this lecture today is irrelevant to me because we have a even like more severe risk of doomsday from the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Like the World Economic Forum took over the United Nations last year, and then they created this hoax coronavirus pandemic that doesn't really exist, so that they can have a pretext to institute global totalitarian technocratic fascism, which is going to, they might kill most people in the world, and they're going to enslave all of us. And I don't see any future with this. They've taken away our right to assembly, our right to association, our right to travel, and they're forcing people to wear these unhealthy dehumanizing masks. It makes me really sad to see that we're not, like, we should be meeting in community church in person. It makes me sad to see Dean and the musicians wearing these slave masks, and I don't understand why radical revolutionary people aren't like opposing this fascist tyranny, that we're under fascist occupation now, and leftists have become irrelevant because we're not opposing this. And I remember, like, after the Boston Marathon bombing, I went to another event at the Cambridge Friends Meeting House, and Joe Gerson was there, and they were talking about how the government was using the Boston Marathon bombing for like a dress rehearsal of like a lockdown of society, like when they made everybody in Cambridge and Watertown stay in their houses while they were looking for the Tsarnaev brothers. But now that we have the main event, like, nobody is speaking out against this. And so I just wanted to say that, and I don't know if anybody can address the question, because I know you all disagree with me, but we're in really dire straits here. And they're going to kill us with these vaccines. They're not real vaccines. They're these things that are designed to kill a lot of people. Bill Gates says that he wants to use vaccines to lower human population. He's a eugenicist. This whole thing is a eugenics project. And but anyway, they're going to have like vaccine cards and passports, and you're not going to be allowed to do anything if you won't submit to being poisoned. So thank you.
Thanks, David. I wear a mask to protect myself and to protect the 4 or 5 people who are in this lonely auditorium from whatever I'm carrying. And that's my comment, David, to your mask question. Dan, any further observation?
I will say, you're aware, David, I agree with you that you said none of you agree with me. I can't speak for the others. I don't agree with you. And that doesn't mean that I don't agree that conspiracies exist. As I've said today, I was part of a conspiracy to get into war with Vietnam, but in the larger sense, on the nuclear, my silence for so long may be part of the most dangerous conspiracy of all, and that is not to conduct nuclear war, but to maintain a risk of nuclear war that will enable us this year and last year to continue as the quote leader, which Biden emphasized, of Europe, without being a European power, but on the basis of a readiness and commitment and threat to blow up the world under some circumstances involving Europe, all of this involving an immense hoax that the weapons we're building by Raytheon and Boeing and others are better used first than second and will allow us to destroy ICBMs over there, which they will, to the benefit of the US, which will in fact not occur because of the smoke they themselves loft into the atmosphere, and the submarine weapons on each side, which will not be reached. So the idea that our counterforce weapons made by these aerospace firms will limit damage in a nuclear war to a level that will enable us to carry out our commitments is a vast hoax, as much as the idea that anti-ballistic missiles will actually limit damage. So, David, we're talking then, I couldn't agree more that there are massive hoaxes that go on and delusions and denials that are in many ways led by our most prestigious people and our leaders, including the kind we have now and will have 2 months from now. I think, nevertheless, one has to sort of pay some attention to evidence into which conspiracies you fully have confidence in and which not. I don't agree with you, let me say very clearly, that the pandemic is a hoax or was started as a conspiratorial matter for any purpose, or that masks are. I don't agree with that. But that doesn't mean that I don't think I can learn anything from you or that we don't agree on major fundamental things. From what you say, I have no doubt that I agree with more things with you than I would with, let's say, most Republicans right now. You haven't said, by the way, whether you happen to believe that the election was not won by Biden, and I doubt if you're a Republican. But I am saying that what you said is shared, and I think wrongly, with tens of millions of people who do believe that Trump won the election and that there's no pandemic and so forth. So, in other words, I think to be human is to be susceptible of manipulation, of demagoguery, and of fears as well that I share and others share that are not founded in reality. That's human. You're a human, I'm a human. And we are absolutely both capable of that. And I think what you said illustrates a mistaken belief at this time. But we all share that capacity. And I'll tell you one last thing. When I saw the plans for the killing of 600 million people by people just like me that I was working with, except that I was horrified when I saw that, and they seemed to live with it, and they'd been participating in it. One thought was, we've been involved in something evil here. And of course, what you're describing, if I believed it, would unquestionably be evil. Let me tell you something that I think, but I don't think it actually works quite that way. On the other hand, I think the people who say that the president, who says, this gets me into deep water here with you, you're not the president. But when the president says, don't wear masks, I think he's been responsible for a lot of deaths. You and I disagree with that.
He doesn't say don't wear masks. He wears masks. I mean, he still believes in this virus. He's part of it.
Sometimes I wear masks, but he rips it off so clearly. He's discouraged people. He has educated scientists who rely on masks. And I believe, by the way, that Biden is about to, he's indicated, call for much more mask wearing than before and isolation for a while that will have effects on the economy in the short run. And
Yeah, but that's why Biden is a greater evil than Trump.
yeah, no, I think not on that point. But as I said, when I saw these plans, this is the last thing I want to say. When I saw these plans, the other thought I had was, this is how the world is going to end. And again, this is shorthand, because I never thought, if I said it before, I misspoke, that all life was at stake. I'm impressed by the scientists that I talked to, like Alan Roebuck and Brian Toon, that even nuclear winter doesn't kill everybody and even all humans. And I don't think I've ever really believed that, but I might have said it carelessly as shorthand. But what I did think was, we're not probably going to survive this, because if humans could have made these plans as they still are 50 years later, I don't think we're going to go indefinitely without using them. Is that a certainty? No. For goodness sakes, I can't say it myself. For God's sake, though, I'm used to doing this, or so help us God. But it's not certain that we'll do it, but I think it will take another miracle for another 70 years to go by without these plans being used. Fortunately, miracles are possible. It was a miracle that the Berlin Wall came down. It was absolutely unforeseeable and unforeseen. It was a miracle that Mandela came to power without a violent revolution in South Africa. Fortunately, in my opinion, it was a miracle that the war ended in Vietnam in '75 because of Nixon leaving office after the greatest landslide in some respects in history. So these things can happen. That's what we depend on. And you and I can disagree on specific conspiracies, but that foreign policy is carried on by both parties currently as a conspiracy. No, that's the truth.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, you've been so generous with your time. We've gone an hour over what we usually go, and I want to give the last word to Anne. Seeing as I don't think we've had a single question from a woman on this call, which is a horrendous thing. Anne, please take it away.
Thank you very much. It's so wonderful again to hear from you, Dan. I want to let you know that your friend Ray McGovern and Niels Meltzer will be presenting at a Unitarian Church Zoom forum through Milwaukee on January 17th. But I also have a question. During the Assange trial, there were two witnesses from the UC Global company that is now engaged in a trial in Spain for having spied on Assange and his lawyers and his doctors while he was in the embassy. And I believe that the prosecution actually admitted that they had taken, they were in possession of Assange's computers. And I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship of that spying to what happened in your trial for the Pentagon Papers when your psychiatrist's office was broken into.
That's a very apt question. And in fact, when we learned just a couple of, maybe a month ago, of this testimony, sworn testimony via virtual, but it had been sworn in person in Spain by people who were aware of these criminal actions again, and in our country, unconstitutional actions against Assange while he was in, spying on and recording his conversations with his doctors and with his lawyers all together, and a discussion of kidnapping or killing him, poisoning him. That was a reproduction of this pattern of events in my trial that led to the dismissal of charges. In my case, that offends the sense of justice, pattern of criminal behavior by the White House, which had the much more significant effect of figuring in the impeachment of Nixon, which faced him with impeachment and led to his resignation, and which in turn made the war endable, which it did about 9 months after he left office. And so when I gave this talk in May 23rd, 1971, to the community church, say the Pentagon Papers came out 3 weeks later, and that September, Labor Day, the so-called plumbers to stop leaks, specifically new leaks by me. Hardly anyone has really absorbed that fact, but that was their basic purpose, was to stop me from revealing stuff about Nixon that was not included in the Pentagon Papers, which ended in 1968. So the plumbers burglarized this office a few months after my talk. Without that having happened, at the orders of the White House, facing Nixon with evidence, with testimony from them that he had committed a domestic crime against an American citizen, unlike what we were doing to the Vietnamese. This, it turned out, Congress and the public was concerned about. This was something that could happen to them here. Okay, that wasn't enough. It turned out that wasn't the only thing, the burglary. They had also overheard me on what were then illegal warrantless wiretaps, now made legal, supposedly, or not constitutional, I would say, but legalized by the so-called Patriot Act and other acts. All the actions taken against me, which faced Nixon with impeachment and even prosecution, have now been legalized, with the possible exception of the attempt to kill me or incapacitate me totally on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, exactly as Anwar al-Awlaki was fingered for execution by drone without trial, indictment, jury, or anything else, an American citizen born in this country, but taking the name Anwar al-Awlaki, or he had the name, and Obama executed him. And then, for reasons never fully explained, his again American-born 16-year-old son who was looking for him a few weeks later in a separate strike that's never been rationalized. Now, that is boasted about by the Obama administration, meaning that in effect, it has been decriminalized for an American president. No one has suggested prosecution for Obama for this extra legal execution. And how many of those? Well, we just saw Suleimanov. We've seen Fakhrizadeh, as that executed, almost certainly with the involvement, well, Soleimani, we know with Trump. Okay, again, not American citizens. But what will be done, in other words, to provoke an even greater response from Iran in order for him to carry out these executions now? Coming back, it's absolutely the case that it is outrageous for this judge in England, this going to judge on January 5th, to be even considering still sending Julian Assange back to America in two bases, to face trial that he can no more get a fair trial facing the Espionage Act than any of the people so far charged under the Espionage Act, none of whom, starting with me, was able to tell the jury why she or he did what they did. I was not able to tell that under the rules of the trial. Irrelevant. That's not a fair trial for a whistleblower. And second, Assange will be, of course, the first journalist to be tried for this. Remember, these charges are for what he did do in the way of revealing murder in 2010. Nothing to do with what he did in 2016, which earned him the enmity of Hillary Clinton, but of very many people in the world, Democrats, including me on this point. In other words, it's possible for me to even regard someone as a friend whose judgment, in my opinion, has been affected by being wrongfully in confinement for over 10 years. But anyway, at the same time for acts that he is also charged with for earlier, which were absolutely legal and constitutional and right for him to do. Just as Dan Berrigan said of me, yes, Assange and Chelsea Manning did the right thing in 2010 about informing us about a pattern of torture and assassination that was criminal and that needed to be revealed. So to continue this trial after it's revealed that the same kind of threats of killing as were done against me, which led to the ending of my trial, rightly so, even though they were then illegal and perhaps now have been legalized. But strictly speaking, they hadn't been legalized by Obama in 2010 when he was, well, maybe they had, take that back, Obama came in 2009. So this wasn't Obama coming in. And Obama himself was subject to being indicted in the World Criminal Court for the torture of Iraqis, prisoners that he was turning over to Iraqis to be tortured. Clear crime. So in conclusion, yes, just as my trial was ended rightly for this exposure of this criminal act, Assange's should be ending. And it is absolutely wrong for them actually even considering extradition under these cases, though it is in fact likely still, but still possible. You know, we're working against it. And we're ending, this is the last question, I'll end with this. The Pentagon Papers did not end the Vietnam War by any means. It went on for 4 more years. And the next year saw the heaviest bombing in human history for a 2-week period, the Christmas bombing, which involved explosive power of a Nagasaki bomb, 20,000 tons. For that, I can say that at the time I was speaking, I foresaw no end to the Vietnam War till at least the next administration of 77. At the end of Christmas 72, after Nixon had been elected in a landslide, a year and a half after the Pentagon Papers, still conducting the war, the heaviest bombing, when people asked me, what have you accomplished with the Pentagon Papers? I said, nothing. The anti-war movement as a whole, with Joe Gerson and Dan Berrigan and many other people here involved listening, I'm sure, everybody has accomplished nothing. I said, the American people had no more influence over their foreign policy this week, bombing Hanoi, than the Russian people had over the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And we purport to be a democracy. They really didn't. But I was wrong. The bombing did end a couple of months later because Congress was about to cut all the money off. And because of the revelation of Nixon's crimes, he was facing indictment later. And had it not been, not just for me, but all the people that led to Nixon's indictment by using impeachment proceedings like John Dean, who told the truth to the prosecutors, Alex Butterfield, who revealed the taping in Nixon's office. Without that, the war would have gone on throughout Nixon's terms. Without Elliot Richardson and second man, what was his name, who ended my trial actually from the FBI, Ruckelshaus, again, refusing to fire the special prosecutor, without the special prosecutor, et cetera, et cetera. Without a chain of events of which Patricia and I were one link, but involving 50, 100 people, each of which was essential in doing something they were not expected to do, it did have an effect. And that was the kind of miracle we all should try to be part of. Thank you.
Daniel Ellsberg, thank you so very much. All of you who joined on Zoom, at one point there were 70 of us. thank you so very much. And on YouTube, which will be preserved for perpetuity, Dan Greenspan, Tim Ray, thank you. Joe Gerson and Ray McGovern. We're going to end on, again, the Sacco and Vanzetti plaque with the words of Charlie King, one of our winners, songwriter, who wrote this: "We will remember this good shoemaker. We will remember this poor fish peddler. We will remember all the strong arms and hands that never once found justice in the hands that rule this land. And all who knew these two good men knew they never had to rob or kill. Each had lived by his own two hands and lived well. And all their lives they had struggled to rid the earth of all such crimes. And all our lives we must struggle to rid the earth of all such crimes."
Woo-hoo! Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody. One last applause for Daniel Ellsberg. Thank you, everybody. When Chris Hedges next week, we'll see you then. Okay, meeting is over. Meeting